Mr. Chairman, and I want to say thank you to both of the witnesses for joining us today. You know, before we broke, I thought the exchange with Senator Schumer was actually quite revealing, where Senator Schumer asked Mr. Smith, well, gosh, why can't we restrict the freedom of American citizens? Because after all, when members of Congress vote, our votes are public. And I think that really reveals the issue here, that the votes of members of Congress are public because we are supposed to be public servants. We are supposed to be accountable to the American people. And indeed, what this effort is about, and what much of the efforts of this Senate is about, is trying to have politicians hold the American people accountable, which is backwards from the way it's supposed to work. Jefferson famously said, when leaders fear the citizens, there is liberty. But when citizens fear their leaders, there is tyranny. We're just a few months away from an election, and so often Congress will devolve into the silly season, where we'll have a series of votes that are not intended to pass, but are intended somehow to be messaging votes because the majority party thinks it will be beneficial for the upcoming election. Related to this legislation is a proposal that has been voted on by the Senate Judiciary Committee that 47 Democrats have put their name to a constitutional amendment that would repeal the free speech provisions of the First Amendment. It is the most radical legislation the Senate has ever considered. In 1997, when the Senate considered a constitutional amendment along similar lines, then Senator Ted Kennedy said the following, quote, "In the entire history of the Constitution, we have never amended the Bill of Rights, and now is no time to start." I emphatically agree with Senator Ted Kennedy. Likewise, Senator Russ Feingold, not exactly a right-wing conservative, said the following, quote, "Mr. President, the Constitution of this country was not a rough draft. We must stop treating it as such. The First Amendment is the bedrock of the Bill of Rights." And he continued in 2001, "I want to leave the First Amendment undisturbed." For 47 senators to put their name to a constitutional amendment that would repeal the free speech protections of the Bill of Rights is astonishing. And it ought to be disturbing to anyone who believes in free speech, to anyone who believes in the rights of the citizenry to express their views in politics. And Mr. Smith, I want to ask a question to you. At the Constitution Subcommittee's hearing on that proposed constitutional amendment, I'm the ranking member on that subcommittee. The chairman is Senator Durbin. I asked Chairman Durbin 3 questions about the amendment that he had introduced. The amendment, by the way, provides that Congress can put reasonable restrictions on all political speech. I would note, by the way, the First Amendment right now does not entrust determinations of reasonableness to members of Congress. Congress thought the Alien and Sedition Acts were reasonable. And indeed, the heart of the First Amendment is about protecting unreasonable speech, not reasonable speech. When the Nazis wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, Nazi speech is the very definition of unreasonable speech. It is hateful, bigoted, ignorant, and yet the Supreme Court rightly said the Nazis had a First Amendment right to express their hateful, bigoted, ignorant, unreasonable speech. And then all of us have a constitutional right, and I would say a moral obligation, to denounce that speech. Because as John Stuart Mill said, the best cure for bad speech is more speech, not restricting it. So the 3 questions that I asked Chairman Durbin, I said, do you believe Congress should have the constitutional authority to ban movies? Do you believe Congress should have the constitutional authority to ban books? And do you believe Congress should have the constitutional authority to ban the NAACP from speaking about politics? And what I observed is that for me, the answer to all those three questions is easy. Absolutely not, in no circumstances. And yet, on the amendment that every single Senate Democrat on the Judiciary Committee voted for, Congress would have the constitutional authority to do all three of those. My question to you, Mr. Smith, is what is your view of the dangers of giving Congress the constitutional power to ban movies, to ban books, and to ban groups like the NAACP from speaking about politics?
Well, thank you, Senator. I think the danger is obvious, and it goes to the core of why we have a First Amendment. And you've hit the point, I think, very well when you said, the precise idea of the First Amendment is to prevent Congress from deciding what's reasonable. There was a view that this was too dangerous a power to cede to the government. During the first panel, Senator Whitehouse mentioned that he didn't want to dissuade anybody from speaking. He just wanted to have people disclose their information. But if you look at, for example, this bill, many parts of it require regulatory regime that will dissuade people from speaking, including the possibility of prosecution if people make mistakes in knowing what other folks they're going to give money to will do. And Senator Whitehouse has been very vocal in urging criminal prosecutions against political speakers. So, I think the First Amendment is there precisely to say this is just too dangerous a power to give to the government. As Chief Justice Roberts said in the McCutcheon decision, the last people we want deciding, who needs to speak more, who needs to speak less in a campaign, or what's reasonable regulation, is the government itself, the people who have a vested interest in being returned to office. And as I've often pointed out, even assuming the good faith of all actors, if rules and regulations tend to favor the party in power and the incumbents, then they will remain in place. And if they tend to disadvantage those people, then they will be changed. So we don't have to assume bad faith to see the danger in giving government that kind of power.
Well, and we have seen in the Senate Judiciary Committee, there were some Democratic co-sponsors of the amendment who said it is not our intention to ban movies or ban books or ban the NAACP from speaking. And at that hearing I observed, this is the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate. The inchoate intentions of members of this committee that may be buried in their hearts are not terribly relevant when 47 senators are proposing a constitutional amendment to the Bill of Rights that would explicitly, under the language of the amendment, give Congress the power, and the amendment says to prohibit speech from any corporations. Paramount Pictures is a corporation. Under the language of that amendment, you could prohibit Paramount Pictures from publishing a movie critical of a politician. Indeed, Citizens United, which is subject of so much demagoguery, was the federal government trying to find a movie maker who dared make a movie critical of Hillary Clinton. I think the movie maker has a constitutional right to do so, just like Michael Moore has a constitutional right to make movies that I think are pretty silly, but he's got a constitutional right to continue to make them for all time. As regards to books, Simon & Schuster is a corporation. Under the text of the constitutional amendment, Congress could prohibit Simon & Schuster from speaking, as the ACLU said. For those of you who are here today who may say, well, Cruz is a Republican. I'm skeptical of what Republicans say. If you're skeptical of what I say, perhaps you're not skeptical of the ACLU. The ACLU said in writing this amendment would fundamentally abridge the free speech protections of the First Amendment, and they said it would give Congress the power to ban Hillary Clinton's book, Hard Choices. There's a reason that I have referred to the proponents of this amendment as the Fahrenheit 451 Democrats, because they are literally proposing giving Congress the power to ban books. That ought to trouble everyone. And with respect to the NAACP and La Raza and the Human Rights Campaign and Sierra Club and Planned Parenthood are all corporations, and they should not be prohibited from speaking. We should be empowering the free speech of the citizens, not empowering the IRS and Congress and government to silence and regulate the speech of the citizenry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. As one of the sponsors of that amendment, I'm not sure we're talking about the same document, because the one I sponsored talks about regulating campaign contributions. It doesn't talk about banning books or movies or in any other way abridge the free speech, but I'm sure that's a debate that you and I can have at a later date. Thank you for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, just in response to the question you asked, I would note that the text of the amendment says, quote, Congress and the states shall have the power to implement and enforce this article by appropriate legislation and may distinguish between natural persons and corporations or other artificial entities created by law, including by prohibiting such entities from spending money to influence elections. And since book publishers are almost always corporations, under the explicit text of that constitutional amendment, Congress would have the power to prohibit corporations like Simon & Schuster from publishing books, which I would note is exactly what the ACLU said in response to it as well. And so that is the plain text of the amendment that has been introduced, and I think it is a very dangerous suggested addition to the Bill of Rights of our Constitution.
A discussion which we shall undoubtedly continue at a later date. Thank you, Senator. Senator Klobuchar.